Thanks. My name's Chris Davis. I'm an associate professor of material science and engineering. I'm also with the RISES faculty cluster, and I have secondary joint appointments with the Florida Solar Energy Center and do a lot of work with them, as well as with Creel. And I'm going to be talking about solar energy, specifically some interdisciplinary and multifaceted research projects and concepts and ideas that we have with the goal of trying to accelerate the adoption of solar energy technologies. And so just a little bit of an update. I presented almost exactly 2 years ago at the same seminar. So since that time, I've moved from assistant to associate, which is nice, and also looked at new areas. I'm teaching new classes now. Currently, I'm teaching the materials senior design class. It's a new undergraduate program in materials. So it's only our second crop of students. So that's been a great experience. And in terms of some important accomplishments since the fall of 2017, I've been PI or co-PI on 8 projects with quite a bit of funding. And I've published 35 journal articles since that time, including 12 so far this year. And I've been able to give some nice invited talks at conferences like MRS and AVS. And then in 2018, I was named to the Electron Device Society's Photovoltaic Devices Committee for IEEE. And then I think in addition to these accomplishments, the most important thing that was mentioned by the last speaker is, students are graduating and they're getting jobs and in some cases winning awards. So very happy about that. But my research group generally is focused in the area of photovoltaics. So converting light into electricity. And our kind of strategy for that, which isn't rocket science. I think a lot of people have this similar kind of approach is we first think holistically about the entire PV supply chain. So, if you're working on a specific device or system, we try to have a holistic view going from the raw feedstock to the actual device to the finished package component to the final system. So we think a lot about that. And then we also consider the entire system and all the constituent materials that go into making that product across different length scales and time scales. So what I mean there is, we go from field imaging, large arrays where you have hundreds of these modules that are, 3 feet by 5 feet rectangles that span, these large areas where we're doing imaging and trying to do things like detect defects, down to looking at nanometer scale, thin films and interfaces within the material, so we can understand how it performs, how it degrades, how it's operating over time. And then in terms of time scales, with the operational lifetime of these products is 20 plus years. Warranties are, typically 25, 30 years. Companies would like to move to 50 years even. So we have to consider like these long time scales and have models for that for various kind of degradation mechanisms. But also, like some of our measurements, we're looking at charge carrier lifetimes on the order of, microseconds, milliseconds, and even shorter. Those are for good devices. Some bad devices have even shorter carrier lifetimes. So we come at this thinking about the product getting light in, right? How can we deliver the maximum number of photons into the semiconductor, the active absorber layer? When that absorption occurs, charge carriers are generated. How can we deliver the maximum number of those charge carriers to the electrical contacts without losing them along the way through recombination losses? And then how can we carry the current and voltage through the device, through the entire circuit that consists of all of these cells connected in series, and then through the entire system? How can we minimize any losses along the way? And then where are the innovations where we can kind of lower costs and improve the durability so that we can, again, make this a more attractive source of energy for consumers at large. So again, we think about the problems and then try and identify areas of opportunity, assemble teams, that with the right expertise to try and solve these problems. So one of the key problems is when you put metal on a semiconductor, it forms defect states. So those charge carriers tend to recombine, so you lose them. You don't get the the current and voltage associated with those carriers. So that's a problem. So we've actually studied this quite a bit. Dr. Lee, a postdoctoral researcher in my group, has done a lot of work looking at establishing different test structures with these wafers. We do something called photoluminescence imaging, where we essentially get a map of the local voltage. And then you can see how, as you change the metal fraction, depending on the processing conditions, you can end up dropping the voltage of the device, and power equals current times voltage. So that's a problem. And then we can show why that is the case. When you tend to get a lot of silver crystallites forming that punch into the silicon, that becomes an issue. So that's one of the big problems right now that establishes a ceiling on where these devices can go. So one of the things we've been looking at is a concept called passivating carrier selective contacts. And in the past, I talked about some work we had done on atomic layer deposition with Dr. Banerjee and Dr. Zhurka. We're still looking at that, but now we've also started looking at this process called atmospheric pressure chemical vapor deposition, APCVD. And in particular, what we're looking at are basically growing thin silicon oxide layers that can kind of passivate these surfaces, but aren't too thick. We can still get carrier transport through them. And then using APCVD to deposit these highly carrier selective layers that can essentially block one carrier type from going through the device, preventing recombination from happening. And APCVD in particular doesn't require any vacuums, very high throughput. It's an inline process. So one of my students has made a lot of progress on that, and was recently able to publish an invited article in a journal on this, and also won an award at MRS on best presentation on this topic. And she did a follow-up paper on this in a different journal where we were looking more at the process structure properties relationships, and found some interesting things, how the annealing conditions impact the voltage relationships between the recombination losses and the resistive losses, and getting a better understanding how things like the microstructure, the crystal grain size, and stuff like that impacts the electrical properties. So that's been an interesting project that we're still working on, in collaboration with Rutgers as well, who were a subcontractor on a DOE project. In addition to these passivating carrier selective contacts, we're also interested in multifunctional materials, particularly these self-assembled nanostructured materials that can provide not just one functionality. They're not just optical in nature or electrical in nature, but they actually can provide an electronic and a photonic functionality. And so I was able to send one of my PhD students up to Brookhaven National Labs to work with a self-assembly expert, and we collaborated with Dr. Kick at Creel to basically show how these self-assembled aluminum oxide nanostructures that can come in different forms and varieties depending on the block copolymers that are used. We can basically use them to improve light trapping and also help passivate these surfaces, so they can lower optical losses and lower recombination losses at the same time. And we were able to confirm this experimentally, doing kind of simulations and in some experiments to kind of confirm that indeed these can perform well. And now we're actually looking for funding on how to integrate this into solar cells as well as other potential devices. And another project that I've been working on that we actually just wrapped up with Dr. Kumar and Dr. Carr in mechanical and Creel respectively, is looking at photonic curing of silver metallization. So in this case, with a lot of these heterostructures, they're very temperature sensitive. So when you go to print the silver metal lines, you have to do a thermal sintering step to allow the particles to coalesce, so you get good transport. But you can't heat the wafers up above, like, say, 200 degrees C, or you start to cause some issues. You start to get, defects form and stuff like that. So we've been looking at using laser sintering as a means to only basically sinter the metal contacts. And essentially the wavelength that we use is transparent to the other layers, so they don't absorb light, they don't heat up. It's just the metal that heats up. And what we've been able to show is that this technique can actually lower the bulk resistance quite a bit, the bulk resistivity of these silver contacts, allowing you to use less silver, saving money. And now what we're interested in is, can we actually do this with copper? Because the DOE in particular is very interested in moving away from silver to copper because of the costs associated with silver. So another problem. So moving to a different area where we needed some expertise from computer science. Electroluminescence imaging is a very common technique, as are the measurement of current voltages. Basically, every module that's produced in the world has an IV curve and an EL image associated with it. And often with these images, they're they're essentially evaluated by human operators. And if you think about like every manufacturing plant producing hundreds of thousands, if not, a couple million modules every year, that becomes very labor intensive and prone to error. So we worked with Dr. Shah's team at CRZV to basically develop a machine learning model to detect, localize, and classify defects. And it works very well. We have pixel level accuracies of 95%. We published this in the undergrad student who's now in grad school working with Dr. Shah. Him and some other researchers formed a startup company based on this, and they've been selected for 2 previous rounds of the American Made Solar Prize. So very excited about that, and thankful to all the collaborators, both at the CRCV as well as FSEC and some of our industrial collaborators. So this is just showing examples of the type of things that we can detect and the kind of the ground truth versus prediction of some of these models that we're working on. Another big problem, PV modules degrade over time. They're pretty stable, but they can degrade. They operate in harsh conditions, and they can be vulnerable to various modes of degradation and failure. And so last time I presented on some work we did using multi-scale characterization, where we do some of the imaging, isolate regions, core out samples, and then do materials characterization to look at, fundamentally what's going on in these kind of material systems. And a lot of this work was done on accelerated aging because, the lifetimes, like I said, are over 20 years. So you need to accelerate that process. But how do you know your accelerated aging techniques, are they corresponding to what's actually happening in the field where you have multiple environmental stressors at the same time and at varying levels? So we just, about a year ago, got a new project started, a $2 million DOE project with several people from UCF and people outside of UCF to basically develop a multi-scale characterization process and apply this to fielded PV modules. And I don't have a lot of time, but basically the way it works is we have access to a lot of modules. We do what's called time series analysis on these big arrays. We down select, and then we do field imaging, and we've looked at some techniques like UV fluorescence as well as some of these luminescence techniques. And then we down select further, and then we look at the actual modules in the lab. Then we core them out and then do materials characterization. So it's kind of a tiered process where we go from these entire arrays down to, again, like kind of micron, nanometer scale characterization techniques to, again, understand why things are failing. How does that correspond to what people are seeing in accelerated aging? And then lastly, one of the last problems is obviously extreme weather can lead to power outages. Really extreme weather can affect the energy sector in a wide range of ways, but we know some of those key stressors can be extreme heat and humidity or cold spells, and then high wind with things like hurricanes. Here's an example of Hurricane Michael, which my family's from Panama City. So I remember when this happened, I had to go up and help my mom and my sister. A tree went through my sister's house and everything. They're all fine, but pretty scary stuff. And then people were out without power for a while. So this is some nighttime IR imagery that's kind of just showing the impact of that NASA collects. Unfortunately, often the marginalized segments of society are the most impacted by this. They can't afford generators. Their neighborhoods often don't have the same level of infrastructure. So it's a problem. So we just put in a proposal recently to the Department of Energy to develop interdisciplinary geospatial framework where we want to account for risk of extreme weather leading to outages for specific communities on a point-by-point, a spatially resolved way, account for their social vulnerability, and then look at where we can add things like PV plus batteries to help these people have access to reliable energy even in the face of extreme weather. And we were just told that we were chosen for a pre-selection interview to the DOE. So hopefully, fingers crossed, this will get selected. And this is in collaboration with Dr. Wall and Dr. Emmerich from Coastal, as well as Dr. Stevens, Dr. Chu from Rises. And we're also talking to FSEC right now about the possibility of replacing batteries with green hydrogen and accounting for that. So we're excited about that as a possibility too. And this is just an example of one of those kind of social vulnerability maps from Dr. Emmerich's group, where you can start to map out these kind of things. And we want to do this for all phases of risk, vulnerability, and then the technology interventions as well. And then lastly, just acknowledging all of the group members, postdocs, graduate students, and undergraduate students, and all the collaborators that I've had, as well as funding from the Department of Energy, primarily the Solar Energy Technology Office. Thanks.